Christine Lower to hand the award for his wonderful work to Michael Lees.
Many members of the NUT, I have worked in schools with asbestos, and it is the tireless work of campaigners like Michael who have kept this in the public eye. It's a very serious issue. He's a very worthy recipient, and I'm delighted to hand over Fred and Anne Jarvis to Michael Lees and to invite him to make some remarks to conference.
President, General Secretary, members of the NUT, and my friends, because I've known you now for probably about 13 years. It is a very great honour to receive the Fred and Anne Jarvis Award. And I thank you for nominating me for this particular award. And I thank you on behalf of myself, but also I work in this organisation, the Asbestos in Schools Group, and also the Joint Union Asbestos Committee. Now, our overall aim is to make schools safe from the dangers of asbestos. Gradually over the years, we are actually achieving that, but it's in very small incremental steps. But in the end, we will actually get there. Now, the reason I got involved in this, as a fair number of you know, is because my wife Gina died at the age of 51 from mesothelioma. As I sat in her inquest, the coroner gave a verdict of death from industrial disease. And I sat there listening to him as he summed up and he spoke about the dangers of asbestos in schools. And I thought to myself, why on earth should a primary school teacher die of an industrial disease? Well, the reason is, in the many schools that she taught in, there was asbestos. The asbestos in some schools was in a bad state. In some schools, it was being damaged on a daily basis. In some schools, they had no idea the schools contained asbestos, and there was no system of asbestos management in a number of schools either. Now, the NUT has been in the lead and lobbying various governments over the years over asbestos. And in fact, when Fred Jarvis was the General Secretary of the NUT, they had a policy, and they asked the government they should survey all schools for asbestos, identify those schools most at risk with the most dangerous asbestos, and then adopt a policy of progressive removal. Now, if that had been adopted, by now we wouldn't have a problem of asbestos in schools. But the policy wasn't adopted. And why not? Well, I spent 2 days at the Department for Education reading and then copying their asbestos files. And there's a letter in there from the head of the Architects and Building Branch, and he is the person who's responsible for asbestos in schools. And he wrote to his counterpart in the HSE, and he said, like you, we are not keen on the idea of surveying all schools for asbestos because of the cost of the surveys, the removal of the asbestos, and any remedial actions will be prohibitively expensive. And then, amazingly, he said, we consider it unfair to single out schools for such surveys, thus implying they are more at risk. Well, they are more at risk because schools contain children. Now, last year, the Committee on Carcinogenicity, they assessed the risks, the relative vulnerability of children to asbestos, and they concluded that children are more vulnerable to the exposure to asbestos. And they actually estimated that the lifetime risk to a child of 5 is 5.3 times greater than his teacher of 30. And so children are far more at risk. The Medical Research Council, they actually concluded in a document they wrote about schools, and they concluded it's not unreasonable to assume that the entire school population has been exposed to asbestos in school buildings. And so there is a serious problem. And what's the end result? The end result is that people are dying. We know how many teachers have died, because 267 school teachers have died of mesothelioma since records began in 1980. 140 died in the last 10 years. Back in 1980, 3 teachers a year were dying of mesothelioma, and now 15 school teachers are dying of mesothelioma. But also cleaners, cooks, school teaching assistants, school secretaries are dying of mesothelioma. Well, the children are more vulnerable, and for every teacher, there are 20 to 30 children, and they're more at risk. Now, a leading epidemiologist, he gave evidence to the Education Select Committee at the end of last year, and he actually gave the evidence that between 200 and 300 people will die each year because of their asbestos exposure experienced as a child at school. And he considered those exposures that people die will be in the exposures they experienced during the 1960s and the 1970s. And so if you consider over that 20-year period, up to 6,000 people could have died because they're exposed, because they attended school as a child. Now, I think that is an absolutely appalling figure. I attended a meeting with David Laws, who's the Minister with the portfolio for asbestos in schools. And at that meeting, I was asked to attend because a primary school teacher who is dying of mesothelioma, she asked me to attend. And she very bravely and very eloquently told the Minister how the school she taught in contained asbestos, how the asbestos was being damaged, how there was no proper system of asbestos management, and how her concern, her deep concern, was about the children in her classroom. And she has developed mesothelioma. Well, at the end of the meeting, the Minister said to us that he is advised by the Health and Safety Executive that the risk from asbestos in schools is very low. The risk for the teachers and children is very low. And I think that is absolutely extraordinary. I don't think any of us here would consider that number of deaths qualifies for a very low risk. And so what are we doing about this? This isn't a problem of the past, because most of that asbestos remains in situ in schools. We know that a number of schools are not safely managing asbestos. And so at the moment, to give the government their due, they are carrying out a review of their asbestos policy in schools. We, the Asbestos in Schools Group, and also the Joint Union Asbestos Committee and the NUT, we have said we want the governments to accept a long-term strategic policy for asbestos in schools. So instead of thinking in 5-year steps, thinking 30 years hence of what they should be doing, adopt a policy of openness, transparency, honesty, if you like. Tell people the truth about asbestos in schools. They should train people. They should train governors, head teachers, and also support staff in either asbestos management or in asbestos awareness. They should reintroduce proactive inspections, which this government cancelled for health and safety in schools, and then they'd be able to identify which schools were not managing their asbestos successfully and bringing them up to the standards of the best. They should carry out an audit of all asbestos in schools. And so if they do that, they're going to be able to identify those schools that are most at risk. But the government has specifically excluded asbestos from the present audit of the condition of school buildings, which is extraordinary. And so what is going to happen is when they get the returns back, their financial forecasts are going to be meaningless. But above all, above anything else, we have asked the government to adopt a policy where they identify those most dangerous schools, and then they have a policy of progressive removal of all asbestos from schools. Because only then will you, your colleagues, and the children in our schools be safe from the dangers of asbestos. Thank you.
For those of you who hadn't known Michael Fred would like to say a few words. So Fred Jarvis.
President, colleagues, it's only my 60th conference, so I now I've got a few things to know, one of them is how to be brief. This award is associated as much with Anne as with me. And I want to say how superb Jan's speech was, because it was all about people like Anne, devoted to classes in the same school, in her case, for 30 years. It's a marvellous job, and in the book I've just finished writing, there's a tribute from one of her former pupils there, who after a difficult start, now a lecturer at Goldsmith College. So it's Anne's award. And incidentally, she was pretty bold. They didn't call her Fred's Fred for nothing. Now, about this award, it's a very important award, and I'm honoured, and she will be honoured, that the union have conferred it. And in this case, I have to tell Michael that I spoke to a journalist on Saturday. He asked about the award, and I said, you were about to receive it. He knew immediately about you and your work, and admired your work. Now that's a true test of an effective campaign. Eat your heart out, Michael Balvez. He knew about the value of your work. This award recognises that this union sees the environment of the school as important. And heaven knows that's necessary. Churchill once said, I think he seems to have said most things. we shape our buildings and our buildings shape us. In the case of schools, we used to have pride in school architecture. Design was important. Today, in this book, I refer to the present Secretary of State. I say, as kind as I can, he's the most irresponsible, gap-prone, U-turning, ideologically motivated Secretary of State I've known in 50 years. His irresponsibility is the fact that he is prepared to countenance the use of shops, pubs, offices, factories, and now, because Boris Johnson's offering them fire stations as well, as schools, for schools. That is irresponsible. And it means, Michael, you're going to have more work to do in that area. So this award makes clear that we, in this union, regard the environment as essential to good education. And your work is much appreciated for that reason, because you know that. And your work is helping to ensure it.
Thank you.
Many congratulations.